Welcome to Just Business. On this episode of the podcast, are you really democratizing access to something with your startup or simply creating a financialized market for it? Then, we talk about how our business models influence our products and discuss the difference between tools and terminals. And if you make it to the end of the podcast, Henry and I are going to tell you why building a relationship with your competitors is one of the best things you can do as a founder. Henry, why do I cringe every time I hear the term democratize?
Yeah, it's definitely overused. I've heard it everywhere you go whenever you're thinking about startup culture and the tech space, democratization. And it seems like it's almost presenting businesses as the white
Hmm.
knight that's coming in to
Right.
revolutionize a certain industry. But I think we're both catching on to the idea that it might actually not be so well intentioned all the time. And maybe the packaging is a little bit or misrepresenting exactly what the intentions are, but yeah,
Yeah.
so
Yeah, and
overused,
I will say
to say the least.
I am one of the victims. Lock me up. I remember 2018 making one of my first pitch decks for the company that would eventually become Mastic, the project management software for creators that I was working on for a few years. But in an earlier iteration, it was all about democratizing access to educational content online. But yeah, specifically for educational creators and video. And like, at least I am a crit of this too. We've all been there. But yeah, we're going to talk here about how exactly what you said, Henry. Maybe the packaging of democratization and maybe the meaning of that word has been diluted and lost. And maybe we're actually doing something maybe slightly more sinister that we may not think of. What comes to mind when you hear the term democratization, Henry? Like what companies or platforms, anything come to mind when you hear that term?
Yeah, to me, it resonates the idea of we're going to make it more accessible. We're going to take away barriers to make a certain thing easier to do. Um, and in theory, that doesn't seem like a great business model. You're coming out and saying, we're going to give away something for free, right? That's the most extreme example
Right.
of democratizing something. So we're going to either take away a middleman or take away a certain that has stopped you from doing it in the past with our new portal. That is
Mhm.
promising and exciting, but I think you can quickly see how maybe that's misrepresenting what you're actually doing. And I feel like I've recently learned, and it, that's the concept to me of introducing a secondary market on top of a problem solution. So you can say we're democratizing something by making it more accessible, but then if you can only access that service through a single platform, then you're actually really making a secondary market on top of that problem solution, which you're then financializing, which then mixes up your incentives to then service that secondary market rather than the initial problem space you wanted to solve. And I think that's where maybe our gears start getting a little grinded on the
Yeah,
terminology of
exactly. I want to,
democratization.
you explain that so eloquently, and I want to just dig deeper and explain some of the aspects of that. Yeah, democratization, when we hear that term, we think about the promotion of access, right? That's
Mhm.
the democracy of it all. And usually that access there's been a major player that has prevented access for some people. A great example of this is YouTube, near and dear to our hearts, probably the platform you're listening to this on right now. uh, YouTube came in
That's right.
with even the tagline of broadcast yourself, whereas it was extremely difficult to make and distribute video in the earlier days of our media history. YouTube was coming in to disrupt that and democratize the relationship between creator, someone that's making video, and the audience, someone that wants to consume that type of content. But in the process of doing that, what of dismantling a centralized authority, a mediary that was blocking access to some people, really what they created is just a new mediary that is dominated and controlled by them, right? They're giving you unfettered access to this audience relationship, but they're still the ones doing it. So you haven't actually gained complete access to a one-to-one relationship, a democratized access between you and the audience. You've just created a new intermediary that may or may not be better than the older alternative. At least in the era of the internet, where a lot of these companies have been using this term, they've made it more accessible because the technology makes it easier for them to make it accessible. No longer do they have to greenlight a bunch of shows and products by middle managers and stuff like that. Now it's just an upload and you're in. So yeah, that's the underlying framework of how this works. And then when that marketplace exists, you've created this secondary marketplace for attention, right? And YouTube behind the scenes is like literally playing a financial game of how do I sell this piece of advertising spot for the max amount of money based on the amount of bidders, very similar to how the stock market works. So, are you democratizing or are you just financializing the industry? These are this is the deep question that we're diving into. But Henry, what is the problem? What's the issue that you have when you like talk about having your gears be ground at the idea of creating a financialized
Mhm.
marketplace? Why does that kind of like make you feel icky or weird?
Because the idea of democratizing to me seems like you're trying to make it easier, socialize a solution, make it more accessible to use. But in reality, if you are trying to concentrate the power by having incredible
Mhm.
success, democratizing, eventually you become even more influential, even more monopolistic than the previous solution. And so that's why it's a little bit icky sometimes, but that is not I don't want to avoid the fact that democratization, even when you have that secondary market or that financialization, it can still be good for
Mm.
certain people. It doesn't have to be, there's not just a myopic view of, oh, only that one marketplace or that one business gets to succeed now. It's just important for us to recognize that incentives are being shifted and problems are being pushed to a different direction. So it might be free to publish video online, whereas in previous instances it wasn't because the cost was just too high. But recognizing it's not necessarily giving something away for free, you are becoming a product, or the incentives are shifting away from you as the
Yeah.
user or
A
the
financial
customer.
product is being
That's
created,
what we have to be aware of.
right?
Yeah. Yeah. Where it wasn't
Mhm.
really there before, which is an interesting concept that I like. And it seems like investors like it as well, of creating a new market. But I think we're seeing democratization being used as a guise to really create those new markets. And that's
Yeah,
maybe not so
and
great all
I'd
the time.
actually you mentioned that a financialized market is not always necessarily bad or necessarily incentivizes one dominant player. I feel like that could be true if you were talking about a financialized marketplace like the stock market, where it is owned and operated by a democratic institution in many ways, like the US government sets the rules and terms of the game. But
Sure.
when you have a secondary market that is controlled by a centralized for-profit authority, like a YouTube, or another example we're going to into soon is like Airbnb, financialization of the housing market. I think that those situations become almost always negative in terms of both the incentive structure and the follow-on effects. In some ways, the centralization of a market in general, where there's one mediary that is doing all transactions and taking like little cuts, that in some ways is like completely anti-democratization, right? You're not actually creating greater access nor creating a situation where people can freely move about in the market. You've actually maybe created what Cory Doctorow in his book Choke Point Capitalism dubs a choke point, right? There's two people on either side of a bridge, two groups, buyers and sellers, and now there's one bridge dominated by one troll that gets to decide when you get access. I don't know. What do you think about that, Henry? Is it where am I wrong on this? Where is it actually beneficial to have like that centralized, financialized marketplace?
Yeah. In the I agree. There are issues, and if you let it go unchecked, no regulation, no moral compass, no wanting to focus your management efforts on that primary user or the
Mm,
problem solution, that first market, yes, there are inevitably problems, but I would say that the positive is in the
we
short
get to upload
term, at the
videos.
very least, and it's
Yeah,
distributed for free. If we were to be distributing this to every single person that watches it,
right.
we might not be able to
Yep.
do it, period. So we might not be able to make this viable. We might not be able to reach an audience. Similarly, if I want to rent my second bedroom or start a rental property, the distribution and the payment, these are all obstacles that would be really hard to solve by an independent, you
Mhm.
know, person without one of these platforms that democratize
That's a
those
very good point.
industries.
Yeah,
So
yeah.
there's a short-term win for sure, almost locked in because that's the value proposition. We are going to make this possible, whereas it otherwise was not financially possible for you to do it. Or maybe not just financially possible, but just competing as an individual in this market was not possible at all. Now you can be an individual and compete in this industry. But I can also acknowledge your point of as that secondary market expands and as you become a lower priority as that initial user, problems are inevitably going to rise. We
Yeah,
got to
I
watch
think
out for
that it's
those.
a really good point to establish that there is a lot of good stuff in some ways that comes for to consumers because of centralized authority, right? YouTube, Amazon, Airbnb, all these companies that have created these marketplace companies have then attracted all of the audience, right? Which makes it really good for sellers in the case of Amazon, creators in the case of YouTube, hosts in the case of Airbnb. Makes it very like a wonderful place in some ways to try to centralize all that connection between the buyer and the seller. I think thing that the place where that only becomes positive though is when the central authority is in some cases like benevolent, like when they're actually interested in um creating a kind of positive relationship between those two parties. In some cases though, and I think we're seeing this recently, there can be disincentives to keeping that relationship positive. Like there's an entire lawsuit going on right now between Amazon and sellers about whether or not they're being strategically manipulated and like Amazon is using their monopoly and wielding their power to make them make less money for the good of Amazon. And yeah, in the case of YouTube, right? Like I think generally creators are feeling pretty positive about their relationship with the platform. But that could change, right? And that only changes by the whim of the central authority, which is probably like one of the things that is ironically completely undemocratic about the idea of like our startup is
Yeah.
democratizing access to something, but we're doing it in a way that's almost completely anti democracy.
Yeah. Absolutely centralized authority
Mhm.
over that market that made something initially way more accessible, but now has put a secondary to
Yeah,
make that
totally.
possible, mind you. Like that second layer is
Yeah.
critical to make this a viable business. I'm more so interested in I think when you do have mass in any market, inevitably things get worse if you don't.
Mm.
So I just think that is, standard business textbook, bad outcomes of a monopoly. We don't need to dive too far into it. But I'm curious if you think the idea of financialization or a secondary market is ever something that is good in the
Yeah.
long
I
term.
think a great example of this is not to always talk about co-ops, but co-ops. So my
Please, please.
wife, her grandparents were almond farmers and out in California, and they joined Blue Diamond Almonds pretty early in the establishment of the cooperative, which if you didn't know, Blue Diamond Almonds is a cooperative of a bunch of almond farmers that's yeah, whoop, that sell together to grocery stores, manufacturers, all that stuff. And in that way, you can think of that as like the establishment of a secondary market, a more centralized authority, where a bunch of sellers have come together to attract the same amount or combine basically their amount of consumers on the other side. And by operating that little bridge together, right, they actually make more money than they would if they were trying to all sell individually, which is exactly the same thing that you're talking about with like YouTube creators or Airbnb hosts or drivers on Uber. Like having the central meeting place, the central marketplace is extremely valuable. The place where it gets not valuable is when that central authority is not owned, operated, regulated, whatever term you want to use, by the people within the market. When the troll sits on the bridge and the buyers and sellers both don't have any authority to change how the bridge works. So I think that's a good example of where this type of, yeah, financialization or the creation of a central authority that centralizes a secondary marketplace is positive, is when it's owned and operated by the people within the market instead of just a third party authority that owns the infrastructure that allows them to buy and sell. Does that make any sense?
Makes sense. It's a little bit of a confusing subject because to me, I think about it as if so there's always we're talking about a business that's facilitating a good or service
Yeah, facilitate
between
a
2
transaction.
people,
Yeah.
really, or 2 entities. Exactly. So we have that, and that exists. The direct monetization of that exchange, I have no problem with and is all good. In most of these democratized situations, there's no exchange of revenue for that
Mm.
initial transaction. I'm curious if that is just a big red flag or if in the long term that's sustainable. I think that it can be for sure. I think we've seen a ton of the
Mm.
software startups and companies in the last 10, 20 years follow that model, but it leaves me a bit cautious because we're now putting in place a revenue model that sits on top of the users and they no longer really have a monetary influence on the business as a whole, which just seems like a really unhealthy relationship in the long term. In the short term, great if the company has that moral character to prioritize
Mhm.
that initial transaction or the initial user. But are you saying there's hope that it
I
can
think I'm
work in the
saying
long
there
term?
is hope, and I think one point that we can delve into more and maybe even deserves its own episode is you're mentioning that first transaction being the one that's like free, that there's no payment
Yeah.
necessary for that kind of upfront relationship to get access between viewer and creator or host and guest, right? And it's interesting to think about how a counter argument to this idea of is it right to centralize the authority for all the transactions between these two groups is that YouTube took on the risk to create the central authority, right? The thing that they're taking the cut on is the platform that they operate, right? They make the marketplace, other people operate in the marketplace. What's interesting to think about is there a way for, creators or viewers or hosts or whatever to come together and share the risk of the creation or establishment of a platform or pay to have this kind of like platform upstart created to get this kind of critical mass? Is there a way for them to do that without taking on that risk or with sharing that risk in a way that is almost nominal, right? Maybe not free, but maybe nominal. And that's a
Yeah.
really interesting question. And I think one that I'd love to hear people's answers to in the comments below. I know this is like a heady question, but if you're a founder trying to come up with concepts for how to build products that increase access for people and create these central authorities, how do you do that in a way that's like sustainable long term in terms of not consolidating absolute power in just your company or your product and actually being able to distribute that more to the people that actually operate the market? And yeah, how do you make that in a way that feels fair, and how do you make
Yeah.
that in a way that's sustainable in terms of upfront risk and long term planning?
A model that I like is democratizing your problem or solution, but then introducing an enter model. So you make it free for everybody, right? So Google Docs, anybody can make an account, use it. Notion, anybody can make an account, use it. But if you're a business and you want more scaled features,
Hmm.
you got to pay. I like that. I don't see a long-term
Mm,
downside of that. But if you then put a secondary market on top and sell access or sell data to those free users, that's where I start to get a little bit nervous, and that's what I would caution people against because your incentives have just drastically shifted, and I would go as far to say they've gone down the drain because you've now centralized the authority, you have all the users, you have all the power and control. Now you're monetizing in a way that is indirect to the users, which sounds good, but now you're not focused on solving the problems anymore. You're focused on
mhm,
monetizing your solution, and that I don't think is how we should
mhm.
approach business
Which
overall.
is a really interesting
Um,
transition to our second topic today, Henry, which is that I wrote in my kind of book newsletter a couple weeks ago about this concept that I've been thinking about between tools and terminals. And I think this conversation is really central, the relationship you're discussing between your business model, the incentives that creates, and the effects it has on your product. So, to go a little bit into what I mean when I say tools versus terminals, a tool is like some sort of technology that is like fully owned and controlled by the user of the tool. A hammer is a tool because I can hold and touch it and take it with me places. I paid for it. It is mine. I can customize it. I write and label on all my tools so that I know that it's mine if I go anywhere with it. And even the components of the tool are mine. If I wanted to use the head of the hammer for something completely different, I could cut it off and use it for parts. A terminal, in some ways, on the other hand, is a technology that's not owned or controlled by the user. It's like something that's rented by the user and is accessible only when the third party makes it available. I think we can all in our digital age understand how this relates. The current landscape of all of the stuff that's on the internet is like these subscription models, these kind of like web only portals, like these things that we're using that often are called tools. And often we as founders build them with the marketing language of this is a tool is really a terminal. It's something that's not modifiable or owned by the user in question. That presents not only a philosophical, interesting argument, but also a real practical argument and way to think about how you build product as a founder and as a company. But yeah, Henry, you're the one that kind of found this to be like a really resonant point in my newsletter. What did you really take away from this
really liked the comparison, mostly because it was just a big shock. I thought it was a bit controversial because of the point of we
tool?
all say, but the reality is, no, you're not building a tool at all. This isn't something that you have no or control or ownership over. Your hammer analogy I really like, but the terminal of the hammer would be if you could only go into a
Mhm.
room and use the hammer at a certain workshop. You don't have ownership over that hammer, you don't have control over it outside space that you're
Which
renting.
can be fun.
Um,
Which
in
can
the
be fun.
digital
Maker
yes,
spaces exist to solve
totally.
this problem. Exactly. I don't need to own a
Mhm.
hammer. I just need access to it
Yep,
when I need access to it.
totally. And so it really depends on what is the use case and what is your true value proposition. Are you saying this is something that you can use forever and always and it's going to solve
Mhm.
this point blank? Or is this something that you need to be reliant on the business long term in order to fulfill? I think the first positive of what a terminal can be is when that tool is being
Mhm.
constantly updated. It's a new tool, it's just getting started to build out a ton of different features to solve many
Yeah.
problems in one space. In that
Yeah.
case,
Someone's
it
gonna
kind of makes sense to have a
exactly.
low
Someone's gonna
monthly
upgrade your
cost.
hammer over time. They're gonna add new features to your hammer.
Yeah,
That's a cool concept. Mm.
cheaper for me to get started to use that tool within this terminal. Good. I like it. In many ways, I think you've already said we're all kind of building terminals, and all of the use cases out there or big successful companies are terminals. I feel like right off the bat, there's two potential solutions, and you either try to solve that control issue or you try to solve that ownership issue. For the ownership issue, I feel like founders like myself might consider a one time payment for
Totally.
this terminal
Lifetime
access.
membership.
So you have
Mhm.
a lifetime license. Yes. Does that, you know, fix the problem in your mind, even though it's only, you don't have control over it? We're still going to update it or not update it. but you have ownership over it. We're not gonna come asking for more money to log in the future. Is that a good thing to
I think it's a good
prioritize
thing
as
to
a founder?
prioritize. There's also some data to suggest that having those lifetime memberships early in your product development, people actually will buy them, and that will help you fund the development in the early days of your product. Where I think it
Sure.
breaks
Yeah.
down, especially in software, is that the thing that you're also selling when you sell software is you're selling support. Sometimes support is one to one, like someone has a question and you answer the question, or you solve something like within a bug or whatever it is. And other times that support is like literally for all customers, like fixing issues based on like the perceived value exchange or the promised value exchange. And there's errors. Software is a living, breathing thing. It is not like a hammer. And so it needs constant updates. And to try to have an idea of a lifetime membership where, I'm just going to give you this thing and then you'll give me money and then we'll be done. I don't know if there's a lot of modern examples where that works well. I will almost immediately give you one though, which is yeah, Affinity, the company that makes a lot of the Adobe competitors, which if we had to pick one company that I think is the worst example of like tools and terminals, it would be Adobe. Yeah.
Okay,
Yeah.
go ahead.
So, yeah, Affinity Designer is a service that I paid for about 4 years ago. I paid for the first version of this when I was trying to get myself off of all of the Adobe products because they were absurdly expensive. Um, and yeah, I paid for a license to that version of the software. I got, I think, updates for maybe 2 years or something. And then if I wanted to get a new version of the product. Really, that's it. If I wanted to get a new version of the product to continue to get security software updates, whatever, I'd have to pay for the next version of the software, which is what Adobe used to do for, I think, 15 something years before they switched to the Creative Cloud model. So the are examples of this working. I'm not sure if it works for all software, especially software that requires a connection to a database. If you think about Notion, that requires a lot of syncing infrastructure and servers to host your data and to be able to share it with other people. That's constantly running cost for the company. And I do think that it should be fair to have you pay for that cost continually as long as you're using those like parts of the product. And so there's, I think, definite trade offs. And I'm not sure if it's a clear, easy answer of, yeah, we should just sell software like we did in the 90s and it'll come on a DVD and you'll be able to install it on all the computers. There are real people that like,
Yeah,
there's a real community trying to bring that type of relationship back between software developers and users. And I'm not completely convinced that works in our new landscape of what we expect from our software. What do you think about that, Henry?
I agree. I think that it's an option. Maybe you
Mhm.
consider it as a founder, but you also have to remember that back in the '90s, software was really
Exactly.
expensive, right? Hundreds of dollars for these licenses. And so now it's way more cost effective to use a software or experiment with many different types of software to figure out which one you want to use. So the barrier of entry being lower, a good thing most of the time. At least
Mhm.
that's what's played out in the market. But if we don't assess the ownership issue, what
Mhm.
about the control issue? The thing that I think about is making the code base
Mhm.
open source so you can now modify and control this software. Is that something that you think holds water
I
as
think
a
that
solution?
in my most ideal recesses of my mind, it does. I love to think about this issue of how do you enable a populace that most people like don't know how to write code, have no idea how this stuff works? How do you enable them to manipulate and control their tools and make them customized to themselves? And I think there are some apps that do this relatively well, mostly workplace tools that are supposed to be customizable, but there's always a limit in terms of what you're allowed to do is actually a feature rather than it is a designed part of the product for it to be flexible and manipulatable in that way. Unlike being able to take a saw to the top of your hammer and take off the hammerhead. Like that's a difficult problem to try to solve technically. in terms of, you know, yeah, theoretically, like, I think it's, like, a total jam, and you mentioned, like,
Yeah.
open source does allow you to get under the hood. You can like, what's called forking a code base, which is, like, making another version of the code that you can make changes to and then publish for other people to make changes to. The problem with that, obviously, though, is that it requires people to know how to code. Now, some people will say and argue that with AI tools and all these things, like everyone's gonna be able to know how to code. I don't super believe that. Just because we have Google Translate doesn't mean that everyone can speak German.
No. No, 100%. Yeah, as a non-technical founder, I don't necessarily believe that that access to development is
Mm,
gonna happen anytime soon, even with the advances. It sounds like tools versus terminals. There are some ways that you can make your terminal a
mhm,
little bit more like a tool, but not all the time, not in every instance. There's pros and cons,
yeah,
obviously, with both approaches. But I really like that framework for myself and for other founders to be
totally.
just cognizant of, where we might say it's a tool, but understanding what a terminal actually is and how that influences your
Yeah.
design and your revenue model. I think it's interesting, but do you have any advice on how we can try to make more tools and less terminals if terminals truly are a problem or the
That's
end
one of the
user?
things that I'd maybe push back on because 'cause I'm not here to say that terminals are all inherently bad.
Okay.
Right? I think that
Okay,
terminals
good.
in a technical sense make a lot of sense in the internet. Where I think it gets bad is exactly like
Yeah.
you're saying, the financial incentives of a business tend to try to maximize for total amount of profit versus least amount of cost. And like to go back to the case of Adobe, like I think Adobe right now was, outed as having 19 people that work full time on After Effects, which is their video effects processor. And people pay $700 a month for access to the full
Yeah.
Adobe suite, but like including After Effects, which is a big, huge player, like almost the still dominant player in the VFX industry. And is that the right relationship in terms of like the amount people are paying for the amount of work still being done to maintain that piece of software? Maybe not. Thing that I would say in terms of like how do we create access or promote development of tools, right, versus just terminals. I think a lot of it does then fundamentally come down to that relationship between the business model and the product. In a world where you are a company that is owned in some way or shares access to the ownership of the product itself, in this case if we're talking about software, like access to the code or the actual like intellectual property of the code, you do make that more of a tool. You push it more like in that direction. If your business is run as a cooperative in which your users of the software actually own the software and can direct its development and where the money goes in terms of that profit to continued maintenance and development relationship, like you get more towards tool. And yeah, exactly like what you're saying, it's important to think about this simply because I think a lot of us, and me included, think about our software and our products as tools. We promote them as tools. We market them as tools. And I'm not saying you now have to start changing your language and market
Yeah.
it as a terminal. That wouldn't make any sense. No one would know what you're talking about. But you
Yeah.
knowing that's the relationship and you being conscious of that and being a good steward of the product because of that, I think is the most important part.
Nice. I liked that you brought up those additional options rather than just
Right.
open source everything and give everyone control. If people don't speak the language,
Yeah.
they can't really control that terminal to customize to them. But if you're able to share the ownership and therefore not just listen to your users, but give your users ownership, then they have control over that terminal, which makes it more like a tool. So I like different options of approaching this idea of
Yeah,
terminals
totally.
versus tools.
Now, Henry, in our last part of the podcast, we're going to talk a little bit about how and why you should talk to your competitors.
Yeah, super scary. The villains, the
Right.
opponents, the enemies. Should you chat with them or not? Yeah, it's a scary topic, I think, for a lot of people. I tend to want to reach out to competitors whenever I'm starting a new venture or working on a project. but there's always a little bit of
Totally.
fear. There's certainly unknown. You don't want to be attacked, so maybe you're a little bit defensive, but you also don't necessarily want to give away the game. You don't want to tell them your competitive edge and how you think you're going to beat them in the market, especially as a new company, right? If I'm a startup, I barely have an app slapped together and I'm out talking to competitors, they have a huge head start. They could just see what my plans are and implement them way faster to a existing user base with their existing development team and my business. So there's fear for sure, but do you
You
still
still do
do
it
it?
is the
Is the
question.
question.
Yeah.
What are the
Yeah, the
benefits of such
benefits,
chat?
I'd say tabling those for now. I wanna go back to the
Yeah.
fear. We have a lot of fear of our
Mhm.
competitors as founders, mostly because we fear a loss of the game, right? We are trained that we are meant to, in business, see our competitors as villains, as antagonists, as people that are out to get us, and so we have to get them. It's dog eat dog world. At the same time, often
Yeah.
in our business circles, we have this mantra, this idea of, being a problem solver first, right? Like always looking out for solutions to find problems we're passionate about, and delve into them and try our best to do something valuable in society. This is the part of business ethics that often gets touted as like a positive of the industry as a whole, that like if not for us, these brave entrepreneurs, these problem solvers, these solutions wouldn't exist. And what's really interesting when you start to think about that in the context of talking to your competition is that it almost immediately proves that you are not a problem solver in the context of building a product as
Yeah.
part of a business. If you were a problem solver, you'd be going to the competitor saying, here are all my plans. Here are all my ideas of where I think that your product could be improved. This more collaborative style relationship and conversation of, hey, I want this to be better. Like I want this problem to be solved, and how can I help you solve this problem? Now, I want to talk about about why actually taking that approach is beneficial to you as a founder, and how actually embodying this idea of being a problem solver is almost a winning strategy in terms of both developing a relationship with your competition that can help you both improve yourself and them and the market as a whole, but also help you win. Recently, I've had an idea for an and I've been doing a lot of market analysis, found somebody that's made something extremely similar, but had some things that I thought rough edges and maybe like almost fundamentally different perspectives on what the problem really is and what a solution should look like. And through much Google sleuthing, found the person running this app. It hadn't been updated in over a year, and I was wondering if anybody was still even working on this. But I sent them an email and said, "Hey, I recently had an idea that's very similar. You have been working on this, but it doesn't look like you're actively working on it. Are you planning on working on this more? And if so, how can I help collaborate? If not, would you tell me why you're not working on it anymore and what went wrong so that I don't avoid that in the future?" And we got on the phone. And like you're saying, there's this little bit of posturing of, ooh, is this person trying to get my secrets? Mind you, this is an app that has
Mhm.
50 active
Yep.
users on it, and my app doesn't exist. And so in reality, we're
Yeah.
having this posturing conversation as if we're like fighting over this big giant marketplace, this big giant idea. In reality, we're two people that have identified the same problem, that are passionate about the problem, and almost quickly after getting over that initial posturing period, we start collaborating. Like what's been going well, what's been difficult. I've had this idea for a different concept. I think that this idea is important to work on. And it was a super cordial conversation. Ended like I think like our team is going to go try to do something and make our own kind of version of this. But I'm going to keep you updated as what we do and like why and all these things because if anything, it helps me get feedback from someone that's been more intimately aware of the problems. And if choose to not work on this anymore, either because I lose passion for the problem, right? Or I don't have the financial resources or whatever, I have at least contributed in some way in terms of making the solution better than it was, right? That's like being a good steward of the idea. What do you think about this, Henry? I've been ranting.
No, I really like it. I've come to that natural conclusion as well, where I wanna learn the lessons. I wanna avoid the pitfalls of past,
Yeah.
competitors or current competitors, and so one of the exercise that I do for any company that I start is I try to do a visual
Mm.
map of the ecosystem. All competitors that exist, the ones that have pivoted away, the ones that have shut down, I wanna know a lay of the land and then try to make contact with as many of them as possible. Mostly as just an exercise in order to make my idea or product better, but it also
Yeah.
gives me a lot of options because then I can look for collaboration, like you already mentioned, but I might also learn my
Right.
solution already exists, and I can
Exactly.
just close up shop. I don't need to be playing this game if something already exists that is as good as my dreamed solution. So I think those exercises are really good and only really get there if you do have that open mind and you aren't super defensive of your idea
Yeah.
or your IP and you're willing to focus on the problem as the primary enemy and
Yeah.
not your competitors.
Right
They are not
right
your enemy
now
at all
exactly. Right now,
at
you
that
have
stage.
nothing to lose in terms of market share and profit and, like, all these things. Like, you don't have anything. So, yeah, the best case scenario for you right now, and we know this as ex-founders, and I think any founder would say this too, the best outcome in so many ways to the startup world is having an idea and realizing someone's already done it. The relief that you feel that you feel a second time founder or
Sure.
whatever is, "Oh, thank God I don't have to do this." You know? Like, yeah. The other point that I think
Yeah,
is so I think that when you're talking about, like, laying out the map, like being a cartographer of the landscape of the idea, I think is, like, amazing and people should really consider doing something like that. Another and that, to your point, it helps you and your business to do that, right? This is not a Drew Woo talking about this is why you should do this because it would be beneficial for society, blah, blah, blah. This is me saying to you as a founder that your relationship with your competitors being positive will be a net positive for your business and the life cycle of your business and you as a founder here. One of the ways counterintuitively this is also so positive is that reaching out to competitors in the early days of having a startup idea is also one of the best ways to find a co-founder. People so often, almost the like top question that I get, like founders or people that want to become founders, is how do you find a co-founder? This is so common in university settings too. And I think it's just all over the discords and subreddits and everything. And what's so shocking about this is you might be in your bedroom being like, "Man, I really wish I had a co-founder for my Tinder for Dogs app." And you might also be looking at a list of other Tinder for Dogs apps, being like, "This is my competitive analysis of Tinder for Dogs." And what you do not see is that all of those people are also alone in their bedroom. Like, and they're also wishing they
yeah.
had a co-founder and looking at the same list with you on the other side. And by combining forces in so many ways, having an air of curiosity and friendliness towards these early relationships when there's really nothing to lose is the best way to find relationships with people who care about the same problems you do, might have complementary skills, and can actually want to join you and collaborate with you instead of compete, which is both a rising tide for you and your business, but also theirs.
I like it. The search for a co-founder and having scorn for the potential matches is, it's just so ironic, but it's a really good thing to try to keep in mind. The example that has really given me a lot of confidence to talk with competitors more is not so much in the case of, "Oh, we're all early stage, we all have partial solutions," is what I was alluding to earlier when you are a very early startup and there's already
Mhm.
an established player. How do you collaborate, contact, communicate with them, and should you? And I would still say you should. And I one of the fears is that they copy your approach and they are able to benefit from your unique perspective if there is one. But the reality that gives me a lot of confidence is we're allowed to have different perspectives. And I am coming to the table with a new idea At least I think it's new, and I see a competitor that is doing something different. The thing that I care about is why are
Right.
they doing it different? Why did they come to that conclusion? Why have they gotten success with that solution when I have a whole different approach and a whole different solution? So, figuring out that why is almost critical to your success. But it isn't necessarily something you should be afraid of that, oh, they have a different approach. If I tell them my approach and it's
Mm,
better, they will adopt it. It's not necessarily the case. So they might have a different revenue model, they might have a different priority of features or entire solution. Both can exist. And I just feel like that alone has given me a lot of confidence to be more transparent, be more collaborative in problem spaces, and hopefully make my own company better for it
amazing,
by
Henry.
being more open.
This is something that I think I'd love to hear people's thoughts on in the comment section down below on YouTube, or contact us on LinkedIn, wherever you're listening to this, wherever you follow us. I want to thank everyone for being here. Henry, thank you for being here. I want to thank everyone for watching. Don't forget to subscribe. And we'll catch you in the next one.